Hey, y'all, welcome to Geek Freaks. I am Frank, and today I am with Holly Swinyard. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. It's going to be really fun.
That's excellent. Holly, you have a new book called A History of Fans and Fandom. Can you explain what this book is about?
I always feel like the title is a little bit misleading, but that's publishers for you. It's part history, part social commentary, part deep dive into the psyche of fans and what it is to be a fan, why people do it, where it's come from, what the history is behind it, how we've got to what we know as fandom, in pop culture now, and maybe kind of where it's going in the future, without hiding away from some of the darker elements of it as well. I wanted to make sure it was a uh, unbiased as possible view. And it's quite difficult when you're a fan yourself to be unbiased because you want to just shout from the rooftops how fun this thing is you do. But it was I didn't want to not talk about some of those things. But it's a really fun. I wanted it to be a book for anybody who is a fan to pick up and go, I know about this, this is cool, but also maybe to help people who want to explain what fandom is or want to learn about it, give a bit more of an idea about where where you stand. Like it's always important to know as a person, if you're passionate about something in any way, what your own history is and what, where you come in the line of other people. So it was kind of like that. I was exploring, I guess, the roots of the subculture that I'm part of, but also why other people do it and why it's so much fun to do it with other people. So yeah,
So it
it's definitely
sounds
that's. Oh, sorry.
no problem. Well, it sounds like you have like kind of two audiences you're aiming for, both the fans within the fandoms and trying to let them know where they came from. But I like the idea of also having a place for somebody who maybe is not understanding why these fandoms exist as an outsider and giving them kind of an entry point and explaining it.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people may have seen things like The Big Bang Theory, for example,
Mhm.
or kind of know a bit about. They're seeing like all the Taylor Swift fans go on the Eras tour, or they might be seeing people go to Comic Con, all that kind of stuff. But they may be like, "What is this? I don't know what these things are. It feels weird." Or they might just be like, "Oh, screaming fangirls, like with the Beatles or whatever."
Mhm.
And they might not realize that they themselves are fans in some capacity because they may not see it as that because they're not dressing up or they're not reading comic books. And they may see fans and fandom as being something very inherently connected with a certain group of people, particularly teenagers. Whereas actually, if you go to the football game every week and you've got your jersey and you get the different one each season or whatever, you're a fan as much as the person who's dressing up in Stormtrooper armor and going to Comic Con is. It's just a different type of fandom. Sports fandom, there's a huge amount of reading about sports fandom. I think I put a reading list in the beginning to be like, hey, I'm not going to touch sports fandom because it's such a huge topic.
Yeah.
But here's some really good books about it if you want to read about sports fandom. Um, because sports are just like one of those things. The super socially acceptable fandom is sports, right? If you say
Mhm.
you're a big fan and you go to it every week, that's fine. But if you say I go to a Magic the Gathering tournament every week, people think you're a bit weird. Um,
Yeah.
I like the Magic the Gathering tournament. It's fun. Um, but I also kind of like the fact that they're so interconnected. A lot of people go to sports because it's the reason they connect with a member of their family or a close friend, or a lot of people talk about their dad. It was the thing they did with
Yeah.
their dad or a parent, or an older sibling. And people say the same thing about other fan cultures as well. Like almost everybody I spoke to said that fandom, in some way, the thing that was the most important one to them was the one that was introduced to them by somebody they loved. And it was a way to connect to that person. And so, they would sit down and watch Star Trek with a parent, or they'd, be wanting a way to hang out with their big brother and he likes playing video games. So they play video games together. And that was the thing that got them in on their first fandom. And then it spiraled from there. Like for me personally, my kind of first major fandom thing that I recognized as being fandom was Lord of the Rings. And that was because of my dad. He
Yeah.
read the books to me, he encouraged me in them, he saw that I loved them. And so there was a dramatization by the BBC that was coming out on the radio, and he knew I wouldn't be able to listen to it because it was on too late at night. So he was like recording it off the radio onto tape cassettes, which really shows my age, for me. I was a little kid, but he did that for me because he knew it was something I loved and he wanted to share it with me. But and it has been something that's impacted me my whole life. The Lord of the Rings is still an incredibly important thing to me. The Hobbit and both of them are. I think I talk about it in the book, my connection with those things to do with my dad. And since he's passed away, that is my major connection with him. And I think this is when people say, my dad or parent, big brother, big sister, aunt, uncle, whatever it is, best friend, loved this thing, and I loved it because I loved them. And that's a super human thing to do. And that part of the book is like explaining to people loving stories, whether that's the story of your favorite sports team doing the best and knowing all the numbers and like every season they've won or like all that kind of stuff, or whether it's knowing every element of Star Wars and the nuances and the metaphor and all that kind of stuff. That is such a human thing to do. We are made by loving stories. We are beings of storytelling. That's what we do. That's very deep. I'm sorry. But I kind of feel like to disregard fandom and pop culture as like a naff or niche or frivolous thing is so, we've always had it. We love Shakespeare now. Shakespeare was pop culture at the time. Now it's highbrow, but like how many dick jokes, and poo jokes are there in Shakespeare? So many, because he's playing to a crowd of so many different types of people. And that was the pop culture of the day. So like the idea that pop culture is a nothing when actually it's the building blocks of what makes people is so important. And that's why I really wanted to write about fans, because I was like, they are so wonderfully themselves and so wonderfully open about the things they love. I remember Hugh Laurie talking about it once on a talk show and how much he loved going to Comic-Con and like meeting fans. But it was when he was playing House. And he just loved it because he was like, fans are people who love things unashamedly. Yeah. And I was like, yeah, that is such a wonderful way to think about it. We love unashamedly. How else can you describe it?
Yeah.
But, sometimes we maybe get a little bit too into it, but that's part of it too, right? You can't have all of it without, passion drives you. The subtitle of the book is Passion and Power of Fan Culture. And passion can be a double-edged sword. So, I think we know that sometimes maybe we get a little over the top when we do things on social media. And there are some interesting power social relationships. But, you can't have one without the other.
Absolutely. One of the strengths, I think, in fandom is the ability to build communities. And I'm wondering, in your research for this, what were some of the earliest communities you were finding evolving a fandom?
Yeah, so I think one of the earliest ones that I found that was really well documented was actually, talking of Shakespeare, was the Shakespeare clubs. Mm-hmm. Women in around the 1700s were forming clubs about various different things, salons, this kind of stuff, discussing literature. And there was one that was specifically about Shakespeare, and he'd gone really out of fashion at the time. He'd been big during, the 100 years before or so, and then he'd gone very much out of fashion. And there were these women's clubs that were supporting him and basically going around and being like, we should do more Shakespeare plays. We should do this. And they ended up, with the help of a famous actor of the time, Garrick, putting on a festival for Shakespeare. It's called a Jubilee. Mm. And it was essentially a Comic-Con. It was like a convention. It had panels and discussions, and people were dressing up as their favorite characters, and they turned the whole of Stratford-upon-Avon into like a big theatre set by painting these big pieces of wood and putting them up to make it look like you were in a theatre. They constructed like a special sort of seminar space for people to go and talk about Shakespeare in and do performances, all this kind of stuff. And you can still see the tickets and like the order of events for like the whole weekend. It was 3 days, and it reads like going to New York Comic Con. It's so funny. They had merchandise, and like loads of traders turned up to trade to all these people who were coming for this festival. And like part of what that was still exists today in the Shakespeare birthday celebrations. Mm-hmm. They resurrected a statue for him that weekend as well, and that is also still in Stratford-upon-Avon. So yeah, like that was one of the earliest ones I could see like really was fandom. Like that was like, these are people who are coming together to celebrate together in this way of a thing that is a popular culture thing that wasn't necessarily a sport thing. Because we definitely have things of like people supporting their favorite gladiators. There's Roman graffiti and stuff like Maximus is the best, like that kind of thing, which it's unfortunate that because we don't necessarily have as much documentation from ancient times that we can't necessarily see whether these were active fan groups. Probably, most likely, like Romans love doing that sort of stuff. But also people love doing that sort of thing. But yeah, the earliest I could kind of find was sort of what we would call modern popular culture was sort of around the 17th century. We also get things like manias, which is more like your screaming fangirls going to see the Beatles, right? It's people getting really het up and like, oh my God, and almost causing riots around people. There's one around a child actor in, I want to say, the Georgian period. So that would be the late 17th century. 17th century. Someone's going to correct me. It's fine. I'm not an actual historian. I'm an amateur historian. It's fine. But yeah, so these manias happen a lot where people get really het up, and there's like loads of merchandise about things. There's an opera singer who has this as well. So we have that kind of thing happen, but they're sort of flash in the pan and then they're gone.
Yeah.
They're not like an active, ongoing fandom. Whereas I would say the Shakespeare Jubilee and what that is more like that. But you also have people like Lord Byron definitely has a fandom. A weird, creepy, sending him, he probably really liked it, sending him cuttings of hair and stuff like that.
Right.
I mean, this is a man who kept a bear in his rooms at university, a live bear.
It's crazy.
Insane. But then he himself was a fan, and he went on pilgrimage to see the homes of writers he loved. So, people have always been doing these things. Whether we actively call them fandom, because the word fan doesn't come in until the Victorian period. And it's just very much like people like celebrating stories, and they like celebrating the popular culture of their age because they enjoy it. They were very much like coffee houses and salons and all that kind of stuff. People were sitting and discussing poetry, and they might be discussing politics of the age and all that kind of stuff, but they were also talking about that play that was on. My absolute favorite thing, it's not in the book, but it's something I found out while I was researching it, and it was just, there were too many things to include, was that during the Tudor period, when crimes happened, writers would really quickly write plays of the crimes and put them on. And so there were true crime plays of things that were happening.
Oh my God.
And I'm like, true crime, it never dies. It's never going to die.
I would so be there.
Crime. Yeah, I know. And I was like, people always talking about, true crime, it's so like exploitative. And I do think it kind of is. I don't disagree with them, but I kind of like, but it's also been something that humans have loved as long as, again, it's like, it's a really human thing to be like into that. What's that? Yeah. Finding out that there were Tudor plays of true crime was such a funny little thing to be like, oh my God. Guys. Yeah.
With fandom kind of growing throughout history, it feels like when a fandom attaches to something like Shakespeare, it solidifies that in our lexicon. Do you feel like once that happens, the topic then shifts to feed the fandom?
I would say so. Yeah. I think like the things that we now consider to be fixed things, like Shakespeare he's a perfect example because he's like the creator of lots of English language, but it could have very easily been any of the other playwrights of the time. Yes, he was incredibly prolific, but there was Ben Jonson and Christopher Marlowe and there were plenty of other writers. But because Shakespeare had people behind him, particularly later on, once past his death and all that kind of stuff. So once he'd kind of gone out of public consciousness, his fans were still doing that work for him. They solidified it. And then that becomes a feedback loop, right? If you're saying, if people are going, we should put this on, and then other people are like, oh yeah, it's a really good idea. And then it kind of goes and goes and goes. It becomes a cycle. And I think that's it. And so then other people are like, oh, I really like the Shakespeare play. I'm going to do my own retelling of it in this way. I mean, how many retellings of Hamlet have there been? Also, I mean, Shakespeare was retelling stories that he'd already heard from other places. But, Romeo and Juliet is told over and over and over again. And so I do think there's a sort of feedback loop in the public consciousness once something's very cemented, because it's something that everybody knows. People recognize Romeo and Juliet, whether they've read it or not, or seen an actual production of it or not. They get it. They understand the references. And I think that's the same thing. I think Star Wars is probably one of the best examples of that. Everybody will understand the reference of what a Death Star is, whether they actually know what the Death Star is or not. In the same way that probably people will understand the idea of, the TARDIS, whether you've watched Doctor Who actively or not, because they're kind of cemented in the mindset of the public. And that's the kind of thing that I think is when a fandom becomes almost, you're never going to get rid of it because it's taken roots,
Yeah.
So yeah, there is definitely that kind of like once someone's pushing for it, and then other people join them, and it starts to spiral, it becomes intrinsically just culture rather than popular culture. And I think that's it. Sorry, I hope that answered the question. It was a bit
No,
rambling, but
that's perfect. Yeah. And then I'm wondering, with fandoms that do take root, have you found that there's a through line, maybe like a baser instinct, like for Shakespeare, again, going with that love, revenge, things like that? Even with Star Wars, we have kind of that love and parenthood and stuff like that.
yeah, I think there are classic stories, right? You can go back to like Beowulf, which is the hero's journey, the same as Star Wars is. Star Wars and Beowulf have essentially the same storyline.
Yeah.
Hero must fight villain, defeat villain, save the day, right? Overcome the monster, that kind of thing. And I think we naturally go to those stories. We naturally follow the stories of heroes, but there are plenty of other types of stories, rags to riches, the tragedy, the comedy, all this kind of stuff. But I think people find a relatability in them. And so the through line, I think, is relatability. If you can put yourself in that time and place and be like, this, I get it. I see something of me in this. That's what's going to make it that's what's going to make it last. You might have something that's a cult classic, right? Where some people get it, but it's not necessarily going to make that difference to the zeitgeist or the lexicon of human existence, because if only a kind of, in the grand space of human existence, if only a couple of tens of thousands of people are that into it, it's not going to make that much dramatic difference. Whereas millions of people are into it, which is what stuff like Star Wars and Shakespeare have, you suddenly are like, that's making a mass difference to everything, whether people realize it or not. Like, I always have this really funny thing with Star Wars where people are like, oh my God, being into Star Wars is like so nerdy. I'm like, it was like one of the most popular films of all time, even when it came out.
Yeah.
People just forget that because it had like a period of time where like it wasn't really a thing in the 90s. And it's like, yeah. And then it came back and it's still one of the biggest, it's a Disneyland, you know?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like Star Wars isn't that obscure. You know, Star Trek isn't obscure. Yeah. It's just the people who are really into it are different from the general populace who kind of like it, you know. So I think it's that intensity level as well of like, how much does this thing affect everybody, but also how much does it affect those really intense people? So yeah. That's probably that's how I kind of feel it works. It's like, it's a mix between being ridiculously relatable and everyone being able to go, wow, that's so cool, I totally get it, I see myself here, I can connect to this, I can jump into this story, for like the majority of the population, and there being that core group of people who are like, this is the best thing ever and I'm going to make it my entire life. I think you need both. You can't just have one or the other.
It's funny because I've been in situations where, like, speaking of Star Trek, people are like, oh, I really like that Star Trek with, you know, Kirk and Chris Pine. And I'm like, okay, well, let me explain something to you. But then like, okay, hold on. No, I should just be happy they're sharing my fandom. I don't need to go crazy.
Yeah. So my wonderful friend Vivian, who's actually, again, my co-host on my podcast, she is a doctor of fandom anthropology, which is a really cool thing to be. And she came up with this idea of the swimming pool metaphor, which is, if you go to like a public pool in the summer, there's going to be loads and loads of people sharing it, right? There's going to be people who are sitting around the edge, or some sun loungers. They're not getting in the water, but they're still there. And then there's that other person who's dive bombing into the deep end and splashing everybody. And there's everybody else in between. And that's how we should think about fandom, right? Is there's some people who are super into it and they want to sit on the bottom of the pool right at the deep end and just be in it and have the best time and like dive bomb and all this sort of stuff. And then there are people who are just kind of sitting on the edge and they're just chilling and they're still enjoying the fandom, but they're not as into it as that other person. And then there's the people who are like just dipping their toes in the shallow end. And it's like, I think it's a really good metaphor for any kind of fan space, because you've got every type of fan in those capacities. And some people are going to be writing fanfic, they're going to be making art, they're going to be collecting, they're going to be doing cosplay, they're going to be doing everything to show how much they love the fandom. And then there'll be somebody else who's like, I got a really nice piece of art and I put it on my wall and I'm happy about it. You know, that, and both of those things are incredibly valid ways to enjoy fandom. And there may be some people like, I watched the show, I liked it, but I don't need to buy anything. I don't need to, you know, have a t-shirt or something. I'll probably watch it again. I'll maybe get the DVD, because we have DVDs still, I hope. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
My continuous giving away of my age. But yeah, I think that's kind of the best way to think about it, is like, people involve themselves in some capacity, but it's not necessarily the same capacity for everybody.
Yeah. It's funny you bring up DVDs. That's itself its own fandom nowadays, where people are all about physical media. I'm myself, I'm getting into it actually. But yeah, it's funny to
I
see
love
like
it.
people discussing like, oh, this one was only released for, a few months or whatever, and it's developing into its own fandom.
It's so cool. I actually bought a DVD player a couple of months ago because I was like, I need to get back into being able to watch this because I got really frustrated. I couldn't find certain films online. I was like,
Yeah.
right, fixing that problem.
Well, as a cosplayer and a pop culture journalist, how has your personal experience influenced your perspective when writing this book?
I ended up putting so much more of myself into this book
Yeah.
than I ever thought I would. I think I say that in the end. I'm like, I wasn't expecting me to be the subject of this book. Like, I was so worried when it was like it went out into the wild, and I was like looking at it and being like, I talk about myself and my own perspective an awful lot. And then I realized actually I was the carrier because I am a fan,
Hmm.
and my experience is the reason I wrote this book in the first place and the reason I wanted to write this book in the first place. And so actually me being the carrier of the story works. And that sounds incredibly self-centered, but it was more like, if I'm going to be able to talk about this, I should talk about it from a real perspective. I don't want to be an outsider looking in. I want to be the insider who's bringing it out to other people. And it was a really cathartic experience. I cried on multiple occasions writing this book, particularly doing interviews with people where you suddenly realize you had like this shared moment of like, oh my God, I felt the same as you about that thing. And oh my goodness. Like there were several interviews I did where I was just like, we are on the same wavelength. This is amazing. We've been talking for hours,
Yeah.
And then, there were other points where I had to think about stuff like, my dad. And I hadn't really processed certain things to do with him. And so sat there thinking about my dead dad writing a book about fandom. And it's like, oh my God, I wasn't expecting to be here. Like I was expecting this to be kind of a fun, silly thing. And now I'm like, oh. And then there's a chapter about Gamergate.
Hmm.
That was really difficult to write. And I've had a couple of people in reviews not really get that chapter where they kind of go, this feels like you're bored. And I was like, yeah, actually, but I had to change the tone for this because I can't joke and be silly and make little snide remarks about this incident because that's not fair. Like
Right.
that was so serious. What happened to people was so life-changing. I was like, I think I have to bring the tone down. And I think for some people that's quite jarring.
Hmm.
But I was like, I tried to write it funny. I tried to write it as like, let's have a laugh. And then I was like, no, some of the things that they're saying, some of the interviews that people did about this experience for them, some of the consequences of Gamergate that led to particular shifts in politics in the US, we have to take that seriously. And then I'll go on to joke about Anne Rice in Interview with a Vampire afterwards. It's fine.
Yeah.
We can go back to the fun stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were moments where I was like, this is seriously cathartic. This is a really eye-opening experience for me. But also like, I hope that people see and get that eye-opening experience for themselves, where they see themselves and go, oh my God, I thought I was being a crazy person, or like, I didn't realize other people felt like this, So I really hope that emotional core that I ended up putting in, that is partially part of myself, is worth doing for those people. So
Absolutely. I got to tell you, as a lifelong geek, I clearly got the brain,
yeah.
but in a fandom, I'm so glad that you made this story with you as the carrier, because if not, it would have been an outsider looking in, almost like, Goodall with the apes, not quite
Yeah.
being part of the community. But with you being the carrier in the community, it's a lot easier for us to accept your knowledge and what you've learned along the way, as somebody who has felt the same things that we have felt as a fan. I think that's good.
And that's what I wanted. And I could totally understand that maybe that's off-putting for some people. And I know that it's a bit of a Marmite book. I get that, because I think it was always going to be right. Fans don't agree on anything.
No.
And like, I wrote about fandom. Of course, people were going to argue about it. My absolute favorite review that I got was basically someone telling me that I described fan fiction wrong. And I loved they came in and went, oh no, but this is what fan fiction means to me. And I'm like, brilliant. That's what fan fiction means to you. That's so cool. That's so different. I mean, obviously I don't reply to reviews because that way madness lies. But I kind of loved seeing that someone was saying, but to me, this is what fan fiction is, and that isn't what you've said. And I was like, well, great. That's a totally different perspective that maybe I didn't think about, or the people I talked to didn't think about. Brilliant. Tell me more about that. So that's been quite fun to see that sort of reaction. But yeah, definitely fans never agree on anything, right? That's part of the fun.
That's at the core of creating those communities to discuss it.
Yeah, exactly. We love discussing it. We love arguing about fandom. I make a very flippant joke about how humans have always done that. And in some cases, that leads to major rifts in religion if you're going to argue about canon. Incredibly flippant, but
that makes so much sense.
Yeah, I'd much rather people argue about what part of Star Wars is canon and what part is not, than maybe screw up the world with a big war. But that's quite, humans like discussing stories and what they mean, and when meaning, like I said before, like meaning has such different things to different people that writing fanfic for one person is going to be one thing, whereas writing it for somebody else is going to be another, and reading a book is going to be one thing, whereas it's going to be something else to another. And I kind of feel like if I have created in my book that dichotomy, then I've done it right, because if I pleased all the fans, I'd be really worried. I'd be worried. Like, what did I do? I don't like that.
Yeah. I feel like it's an easy answer, an obvious answer, but has fandom gotten more difficult with the introduction of technology like social media and whatnot, or is it spreading faster? It's kind of like the easy answer is like, it's got to be worse, but it's hard to tell.
It's a very nuanced question. I think there's a nuanced answer to that. I think it's a mix. I think as technology, particularly social media, has become more everybody's in one place at one time. Like, there is initially fandom was on forums and newsletters and all this kind of early internet stuff, where it was sort of behind closed doors, and if you knew the password you could get in, a bit more like Discord, right? But also those passwords weren't that difficult to find, because if you were a little bit tech savvy, you could kind of figure out how to get somewhere. So whereas Discord, you need an invite, whereas with these ones, you could just kind of show up and be like, hey, can I join? So it was a little bit, and it meant that kind of everyone had a space. And so if you wanted to discuss fandom you wanted to talk about collecting, for example, if you were really into that, then you'd have your forum that you talked about that, whereas somebody else who might be into the same fandom but wasn't a collector, but was an artist or a scene maker, would maybe be on another board in that forum or in a completely different forum entirely. Whereas now, I think everybody is kind of forced into the mold of Twitter or X, I guess, whatever it's called, and Instagram, TikTok, all that kind of, you're kind of forced into the same thing. And the algorithm goes, oh, you like Star Trek, so I'm going to show you everything about Star Trek without any thought that you might like this specific type of Star Trek fandom, for example. So you might be really into Next Generation, but not that into Discovery, or really into Strange New Worlds, but not actually be that bothered about going back and watching the old stuff. Or you might love all of it, but you're a collector or you're a cosplayer, You don't necessarily want to see the guy who's talking about his mint condition Mr. Spock action figure when you are interested in seeing people discussing the most recent episode of Star Trek Discovery. And I think that's the thing, is that it kind of mishmashes fandom into just being Star Trek rather than this element of it. And you are able to choose which parts you partake in. Now it's sort of forced on all of your and that can be kind of annoying. And that's when I see things like the arguments happening where people are like, you don't understand it, or you don't get it, you don't like fandom the same way as me. It's because people are being forced to be in the same space, because there aren't other spaces in the same way. Yeah. And yes, you can block, you can curate your own thing and all that kind of stuff, but things slip through the cracks. If you just go and check the hashtag on a certain thing, you might see some really bad takes you don't like. They might be perfect, they're perfectly valid takes, but they're not the take that you like. I mean, some are just inherently bad, and whatever.
We've seen them.
The problematic ones, all that kind of stuff. But that's when I think these really big arguments start happening. I'm talking about Gamergate, that kind of stuff. And I think it's because I don't think we want division. I don't think we want the segregation, but I think sometimes you do need to be able to go, I want to go and be on my Discord board where it's only 10 people and I just chill out. But if you're not able to find that board, because that sort of thing is quite difficult to get to, whereas in the past you'd have had a forum or a newsletter, and you're now stuck on TikTok, which is notorious for feeding you the things that make you mad, it kind of leads to that thing. So I do think that in some ways it's getting better because more people are able to access it and learn about stuff and be like, wow, there's so many fans out there. So like on a surface level of getting into fandom, I think it's absolutely great. When you want to deep dive and like, I guess specialize, right? It's like, it's that thing of like, you learn the basics and then you want to specialize afterwards. It's much harder to specialize now into like, I want to talk about collecting. I want to talk about cosplay. I want to talk about this particular ship that I really like. And I want to do that. You know, that I think is the difference and the harder part of it. I think Discord does fill in some of the gaps. But again, unless you actively are invited to a board or you know about it, it's really difficult to find them, particularly if the fandom isn't big, right? So if you're into something like, I am really into P.G. Wodehouse, who is a comedic writer from the 1920s in the UK. He's quite famous here. People would know about Jeeves and Wooster, like those kind of books. Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie made a series of it in the 90s. I love those books, but it's not going to be a massive fandom online for this series. And so finding people that are other fans of it, it was the one thing that Tumblr did really, really well, and still does, actually. I mean, Tumblr's still going. It's having a renaissance, really. It's a bit strange. But Tumblr was really good for fandom because you could curate so specifically what your experience was in there. And I think that worked pretty well. It's not perfect because it still wasn't closed boards or whatever, but then closed boards weren't perfect either. There was still drama. There's always drama. People do people things,
Yeah.
You're people. Any space where you have more than one human in fact, if you have a space with one human in, it's probably going to cause some drama. But, I think it's really, really good right now for getting into fandom, getting into cosplay, getting into all that kind of stuff. It's just when you want to maybe have a slightly less wide experience or a more nuanced or more private experience, it's really difficult.
Yeah. And then you run into an issue with Discord, for example, with discoverability, which is kind of the opposite problem, right? Where it's so niche that you're trying to go back out. And how do you, so for the podcasting side of things, just to kind of see where I'm on this one, I help a lot of other people who are starting the new podcast because I've been doing this for too long. And one of the things I always tell them is niche down as hard as you can. Find something that you're truly passionate about, that during the long nights when you're editing, you're happy to still be talking about it. Niche down as long as you, and then use that lens to reach out to everything else. So if you really like Marvel action figures, talk about how like, oh man, the new Marvel action figures are coming from X-Men 97, something cool like that. Yeah. And so I think, there's a way of kind of mixing that broader fandom and then still finding your small niche in it. But
absolutely,
it's harder now.
Yeah. It's much harder now. And I think it's much harder to build a community in a niche way as well. Like once you find it, it's great, right?
And they're loyal. Yeah.
They're really loyal. So it doesn't actually matter if you have, I kind of think particularly with the current thing in fandom spaces, definitely, if you have a smaller following, they are going to be a loyal following to you. Like my TikTok, which is not super active, but is very Discworld focused. I have a lot of people who are really into Discworld on my TikTok, and it's great. It's brilliant. But it also means that when I then talk about books like that I'm writing like this, which have broader scope, or other projects I'm working on, or if I want to talk about other fandoms, those people are interested in me and want to talk about those things with me, which is great. Whereas if I just come into it like, I like funny books, that's too broad. It's way too broad. I clearly like humorous writing, right? I love Terry Pratchett. I love P.G. Wodehouse. I love that kind of thing. That's what I enjoy. But I don't necessarily, if being more niche to like, let me make funny memes about this Discworld character is going to get the attention of the right people, because they're going to be like, oh. So I definitely do see it, but I do think it's harder to get that attention in the same way, because you're not, it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, really, isn't it? I think technology has its place, and I think changing technology has its place. but I really do think it would be great if we could have a space where, particularly an online space that was a little less algorithm orientated and a little bit more user choice orientated, particularly for everything, but for fandom especially. It would be so helpful.
Yeah.
Like, I want to see this and only this today, please.
And I need to kind of close out everything else so I could focus.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on kind of this newer form of fandom that's been showing up where it's almost like a meta fandom where people are fans of people who are explaining their fandom? Like you're seeing with Twitch and TikTok and stuff like that, where like the fandom of a fan.
I think it's really interesting. I think tabletop role-playing games, I think, are comparable to this, and so is cosplay. Because people are fans of cosplayers who are cosplaying from the media. But they may not know the media. But they might find the media and go and like it because they like that cosplayer. And the same with like tabletop role-playing games, the live play games. People who've never played Dungeons and Dragons are fans of Critical Role. And fans of the characters in Critical Role, and then may go back and look at the thing. And so I think it's that weird double level thing. But I think that's also always been the case. Like when you go back and look at the early days of fandom in like the 1920s and 1930s of what we would call fandom, with the fan clubs and all that kind of stuff, you got people who were big name fans, like Forry Ackerman, for example, or Roy Joe. I've been corrected on this pronunciation recently, so I will get it right. Who was, thank you. But they were big name fans, and people were fans of theirs. They knew them. They were people to talk to. They were people, and obviously it was a slightly different setup because it was more people in the same space together, but they were fandom leaders. And I think that may be it, that we're seeing kind of particularly YouTubers, Twitch streamers, all that kind of stuff, TikTok. They're fandom leaders and people like them and enjoy their content. And so they're essentially influencers, right? They are influencing people's ideas of what these fandoms are. They probably hate to be called that. I'm so sorry. But they are leading ideas into the world. And so they're going, and I think that's a really good thing, because actually I think learning from somebody about something and then going away and taking those ideas with you, whether you're going to go and watch that thing for the first time, or whether it's something you know a lot about and you're just adding theirs to your compendium of ideas, is no bad thing, because it means essentially you are adding to your thought process. You are building on your experience, and it's not just your experience anymore, it's the experience of others. And so having somebody who is there to kind of lead the way to other discussions, and it's one of the things I actually really like about TikTok is like the stitch function, is so that people can have discussions and talk about things and add these things. I don't think it's perfect. I also think that the likelihood of every single person who's having opinions about fandom being a good, moral, upstanding person and not just saying shit for clicks. Of course, there's some people who are doing that, and you can't necessarily tell the difference. But again, that's always been true. It's just we have more platforms to do it on now. So I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think it's just a thing. It's just a thing that's currently happening. And I think it's a thing that's always happened. There have always been big name fans, and some of those people have taken advantage of that status and some people haven't. And some people have used it to launch their own careers, and other people have used it as a way to broaden the horizons of others and teach. And that's a really cool thing, because it means you get so many different takes on ideas and people discussing things and being like, oh, well, so-and-so said this. And I mean, that's how all discussion happens, right? It's all how political discussion happens. It's how all, scientific, artistic discussion happens. Someone leads an idea and other people join in and think, oh, maybe, that's philosophy, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's an interesting case where there's like this hyper following of a person, and then any missteps or whatever like that get amplified, but also they're held to higher standards, so it kind of weeds out people with shaky opinions and starts to form some good examples, I think, for the future.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, Michael Rexon around, who's the cover model for the book, actually, I specifically wanted to talk to him because I think he's one of the most brilliant Star Wars community leaders. He is like one of those fans who really knows stuff, and he, kind of realizing his position in the fandom, has gone out of his way to not just promote kind of positive ideas, but also to really discuss why the negative ones are bad and what it is that people are saying. So he actually talks about it in the book. I include a part of it where he talks about he realized that he was kind of doing toxic positivity. He was sort of being like, no, this is a really great space. Everyone have a good time. We're all friends. And he wasn't addressing the fact that there was racism happening. And he was like, I need to actually talk about the fact that some of these fans, I can't just tell people, no, we've got to be positive. I actually need to challenge people if I want to make this a positive space, because if I don't, some people aren't going to feel safe in it because I'm just letting everybody say what they want. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, that because he suddenly went, I am being seen and held up as a leader in my community. I'm being seen as a really positive role model. I need to do more. Mm-hmm. And I think that is when you see the difference. You kind of, the wheat from the chaff kind of idea, the people who are like, I need to do more. I need to use my platform. I need to use my space. I am the ideas creator, the ideas leader here. So let me do better. And I think that's a really positive thing. And also because other people are there going, hey, maybe you should do better, they go away and think, and they go, oh, so no, maybe I missed the mark on that one, because it's a communal space. So
that's such an interesting I guess responsibility thrusted on somebody who's just sharing their fandom to then all of a sudden find themselves as a leader. It's almost, not to get political, it's how you want politics to work.
Absolutely. You know? I mean, it's literally, I mean, we'll quote Uncle Ben, isn't it? With great power comes great responsibility.
Exactly.
And some people have power thrust upon them. And it's like, you don't necessarily get to choose that you're in this position, but I think it shows a great strength of character to be the person who goes, I am in this position now, whether it's in politics, fandom, whatever. I am here, so I shall use it for the best ability I can. And I know I'll make mistakes, but I'll do my best. Like that's all it could be asked of. And I think fandom spaces need that, because a lot of people who are in fandom spaces, we're there because we find something in these stories and we might be a little bit lost, and we might feel a little bit isolated. And this is the space where we feel accepted. And having somebody who can be like, hey, we're all in this together. Let's talk about it. Let's be open and honest and have these conversations. And I don't for a second believe that every single person who does that is a perfect Messiah-like figure who's got everybody's best interests at heart, because again, humans do human things. And we know that's not true of humans. But it's really lovely to see when it does happen and it does work in fandom spaces, because it means those fandoms flourish. They really do. Yeah. They get exponentially better because there's people in them who are doing better and trying to encourage it. It's one of the things I really like about Discworld fandom is, again, it's not perfect, but because Terry Pratchett was so part of his own fandom, weirdly, he was kind of secretly just there, like going on forums and stuff. He'd make like fake usernames and things like that. But also like he was there at the conventions and he'd be talking to people and hanging out and all that kind of stuff. It meant that he sort of imbued his fans with his morals. I mean, they were going to be anyway because they read his books, but like his presence. And so it's kind of carried on like that they then give that same kind of feeling to the fans who are coming in who maybe never met him. So I think that's you can see it in the Tolkien Society as well, like people who...
I was bringing that up next.
Yeah. I mean, the Tolkien Society is super interesting because it's a very different type of fandom. It's really different. But you can see that they carry forward the sensibilities of Tolkien in the way he discussed the world, in the way that they do it. So yeah, I think that's very much an important thing. This feels very deep. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. And that's exactly what fandom's all about, is kind of going deeper and deeper and deeper and getting to the root of why we fall in love with something. Mm-hmm. And yeah, with Tolkien, one of the things I love about him and his work, of course, is the fact that he didn't want to stop exploring the world and just kept going. And so that makes you want to join in on it. And I think we see that with like Brandon, Sanderson or George R. R. Martin even, although I wish he'd finish up a book, but it's the same thing. It's just like, tell me about every little corner. I'm into it.
Absolutely. And I mean, like Tolkien's fascinating because he basically looked at it from the point of view of, he was telling a history of a world that didn't exist.
Yeah.
And he was approaching it as a historian and a linguist, which is so different. But it also means that like, his fandom, his fans are that kind of people, right? They approach it, they write essays and analysis and all this sort of stuff. And like the amount of meta that they do is crazy. They don't call it meta. They have proper academic terms for it. But like, it's fascinating. I actually was saying something to my partner this morning. I was like, it's really interesting reading fan fiction from different fandoms because you can see, particularly literary fandoms, you can see the writer in them. So when you read something from Sherlock Holmes fandom, it feels like there's a touch of Conan Doyle in there. You can
Yeah.
feel that, right? And the way that Sherlock Holmes is written and presented and all that sort of stuff, it's there in the fan fiction. And then when you read something from Tolkien fans, the same thing's true. You can see Tolkien's almost the way that he writes about things, that they are almost always quite grand. Not always, there's a sort of difference to them. And it's really interesting that you can kind of feel, I can't even like finger on what it is, but you can feel the touch of the initial creator there because the fans love them, and it's there. I think it's probably more visceral with fan fiction with literary fandoms because it's a book, right? Whereas with fan art, it's like you can, when people sort of emulate their favorite comic book artists or their favorite animes, and you can see in people's art styles kind of where they've come from. Like I always really enjoyed in Steven Universe that you could kind of see the love of like magical girl anime in there, and sometimes it was a really obvious reference, whereas other times it was just like a little twinkle or something in the eye, and so you could see their fandoms reflected in how they then did art. And I think that's really cool, that you can see, like, you read certain writers and you can tell they're influenced by people. And that means they love that person. If you're influenced enough for it to imbue your art, whether that's your way of writing, your way of drawing, your way of animating, whatever, you suddenly go, wow. I mean, one of the coolest things is now starting to see cosplayers who are influenced by certain costume designers. And you can see that they love a certain type of costume design because they do their costumes like that. That's really fun that we're starting to see that in cosplayers is really fascinating. Particularly now we have things like the Game of Thrones and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Where you have these very high level costumes. Because you can see when people are like, I really wanted to emulate this certain type of embroidery. And it's like, wow, that's so interesting. So yeah.
One of my favorite examples of this is with Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek, where all the fandom, all the fan fiction and everything like that still follows back on the seed. You okay?
Sorry, my partner.
Good.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay. It still falls back on the seed of Gene Roddenberry's like picture of utopia, that no matter what happens, like there's still hope and, we can be good to each other and stuff like that. So I like that no matter where the fan fiction goes, they still make sure to always have a hopeful future,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the things I love about Star Trek in particular. My parents were Trekkies, so like kind of been there. But it's like, I love that Star Trek is, no matter what, it is optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a really good thing because Star Trek is the one fandom of modern fandoms that has influenced everything else.
Yeah.
Everything that we see from Comic-Cons to the way that fandom operates, the way they do things, the way that modern fan fiction and fan art and cosplay competitions and the structure of the events and all that kind of stuff literally comes back in some capacity to Star Trek. You can trace it back almost every single time you'll find Star Trek in there. And I'm so pleased that it was Star Trek. So that was the thing that it comes back to, because it's hopeful, because it's optimistic, because it's incredibly diverse. It was always built into the fabric of it to be about everybody. And I think that probably means inherently everything is got that little nugget, little seed of hopefulness in it. Maybe not everyone realizes it, but it's there,
But that makes me feel very good. Even I going off topic a little bit, Galaxy Quest, I think is such a great movie in the fact that like it's a comedy. It is poking fun at Star Trek fandom or, that kind of fandom. But, when you watch it, you realize like, no, it's because they're all celebrating it. It's actually more than that. So, yeah.
It's wonderful. It's a really wonderful thing.
Yeah.
It makes me happy. Like at the end of the day, I think I don't want to shy away from the fact that, like I said, there are things in fandom that aren't great. But I do think it's inherently a good thing. I think being a fan of something is a super fun. It's fun. It makes everybody happy. It just like you have a lovely time. I'm literally at Comic-Con this weekend. I'm here doing work, but it's like just seeing everybody having the best time and like sharing their love for fan stuff. It's like so good,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, Holly, it has been an absolute delight. Can you go ahead and tell everybody where they can follow you?
Yeah, so I have a website which has all my links on it, which is hollyswinyard.com. Nice and easy, just my name, .com. And that can link you to all my social media. But my Instagram is Littlest Prince, which is Lilist Prince, all one word. And that's my username on pretty much everything. And if you are interested in hearing me ramble about fandom for an hour an episode, I do have a podcast with my wonderful co-host called I'm a Fan of That, which is where we explore fandom through anthropological and historical and philosophical routes through objects. We pick an object and we discuss where that can lead us in fandom. And it's a really fun little discussion of fan topics, but also pop culture in general. So we don't always talk about fandom. Sometimes we talk just general pop culture. We have now done 2 episodes on Taylor Swift, just to give you an idea of sometimes it goes off the rails.
God, she's like transcending fandom somehow. I don't know. It's crazy.
She's everywhere. It's impossible. We weren't planning on doing 2, and then the Eras tour happened, and we just had to.
Yeah.
You know.
Over here in America, what's really cool is football has always been kind of like the dad's thing. I mean, I'm a big football fan, but like the dad's thing, our football, sorry. And
yeah,
the fact that she started dating Travis Kelce, one of the players, it bridged the gap so much. And what I love is like on TikTok when you have dads are like, "Thank you, Taylor Swift, because my daughter's watching football with me," and it's like, oh my God, it's perfect.
Oh, yeah. Again, I kind of like random.
I know.
Lovely. Yay. That's so good. That's so wonderful. Yeah. I mean, you know, I'm not a big Swiftie. It's kind of funny because I literally know nothing about it, but I love, I every time I see like all the, all the people going to the Eras tour and they're wearing their outfits and they're like, this is this thing. And I'm like, oh God, this is so good. Yeah. And, everyone getting so involved. It just makes me super happy. Like genuinely, I'm like, oh, you're doing it. You're doing the human thing. Yay.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much, Holly. I'm going to have all the links in the description, guys, so you guys click around and follow everything. And make sure you pick up the book, too, on Amazon or at your local bookstores. Again, Holly, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. All right, guys, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye.